And then I believe our next speaker is our own Luke Shelton. So you are, as he's already a panelist, he can take over.
Great, thank you so much. So I got slide envy with everyone having their beautiful slideshows, so I threw one together real quick. Hopefully it'll help people follow along. So get that pulled up. All right, and we will take it away. So in my interviews with young readers about The Lord of the Rings, I asked them to rate their favorite and least favorite characters from the Fellowship of the Ring. I also asked them who they thought were the most relatable characters in the Fellowship. The results may be somewhat surprising. The two characters rated as the most favorite were Sam and Gandalf. The two rated as least favorite were Boromir and Gimli. And the two characters rated as most relatable characters were Sam and Boromir. So to give you an idea of the actual activity itself, it's actually kind of fortunate that we're doing this in an online setting here, because this is exactly how my participants would have seen it. You have the characters out to the left of this little form. And what I wanted my participants to do was to drag the names to put their most favorite at the top and their least favorite at the bottom. So you can see how the most favorite and least favorite are singled out, but in the middle it kind of groups up. And so then I analyzed how participants placed the different characters, and here is my graph with results. The names of the characters are across the top to give you the key, and then you can see how they're rated. And I will go into a little bit more detail about this in the paper. So today I want to talk about the ways in which these results are not surprising and the ways that they are. Furthermore, I believe that what the participants said about these characters in their discussions indicates what they perceive as important, has a lot of overlap with the way that Tolkien scholars have discussed the ideas of heroism and morality in The Lord of the Rings. So the way that participants talk about their favorite, least favorite, and most relatable characters from The Lord of the Rings helps to illuminate how they perceive them. Their observations tend to focus on three things: the attributes of the character, the way the character interacts with others, and the narrative role that the character plays in the story. Examining the interviews leads to some interesting comparisons with the way that Tolkien scholars have discussed character attributes, types, and arcs in the past. This is especially true regarding the ideas of heroism and morality. So let's start by looking at favorite characters. It's not surprising that there is not a consensus favorite character among these readers. Similarly, the extent to which scholars have been able to identify heroic traits in most of the protagonists of The Lord of the Rings indicates that the idea of heroism in Tolkien's work is not confined to a single character, but rather that heroic characteristics can be observed in many of his characters. Perhaps the scholar whose argument aligns most closely with the experiences given by participants is Ronald Ian Likowski. In the 1981 article, Types of Heroism in The Lord of the Rings, he gives several characters in his list of those who have heroic characteristics, including Frodo, Aragorn, Sam, and Gandalf. Significantly, he characterizes Sam as more of the everyman hero than Frodo, noting how he is the hobbit who, more than any other, is raised from relative obscurity into the realm of heroic action. Likowski argues that Gandalf, quote, is somewhat different from Aragorn and especially Frodo in that he possesses superhuman powers like the heroes of classical myth and drama, close quote. He sees Gandalf as a more archetypal hero when considering him in the context of older texts. Participants certainly see Gandalf as fulfilling the role of a mentor and Sam as an everyman when it comes to the types of heroes they see in The Lord of the Rings. Going back to Likowski, if his conclusion is to be believed, Tolkien's portrayal of heroism is especially resonant with readers in the modern era. He suggests that while the modern era is, quote, anti-heroic and, quote, irony-ridden, perhaps what has made Tolkien so popular is his ability to, quote, give expression to this need for heroism for our modern age, close quote. Since his perspective is enabled by seeing the hobbits as reluctant heroes, it is possible that many of the young participants who like Sam would agree with this assertion. Sam's loyalty and love make him an unanticipated hero in the story. These are the very attributes that drive him to take part in the quest to destroy the ring and to care for Frodo. These are the very characteristics that make him the most appealing character to young readers. They admire his dedication and his selflessness. So to move the discussion to least favorite characters, I want to focus on the concept of morality in this section. I used the book The Lord of the Rings and Philosophy, One Book to Rule Them All, to help in my analysis in this section because, while the text as a whole is woefully ignorant of previous scholarship, many of their conclusions are beneficial in understanding how the general public could respond to the work without foreknowledge of the applicable criticism. This helps to clarify some of the ways that participants' discussion of Boromir and Gimli as their least favorite align with Tolkien scholarship. So one such observation is presented by Eric Katz, who demonstrates how one of the major motivating factors of the text is temptation. He observed that, quote, all of the characters who encounter the ring are given a choice. All are tempted to wield the ring, and some find within themselves the power to reject it, close quote. He demonstrates that free will is essential in fighting this temptation, and argues that pure characters would not undergo temptation, thus demonstrating the complexity of Tolkien's text. This aligns well with many of the participants' observations about Boromir. They saw him as tempted or even corrupted by the ring. It's also true of the participants' interpretations of the relationships among the fellowship as intricate and complex. An additional observation of this kind is found in Gregory Basham's chapter. He indicates that Tolkien uses the hobbits and elves to depict, quote, strong, healthy communities, close quote, and claims that Tolkien, quote, becomes our philosophical guide, pointing us to ways of living and thinking and perceiving that can help us lead richer, more joy-filled lives, close quote. Thus illustrating how Tolkien endorses community as an essential component for human happiness. While this may seem tangential, it is the inverse of this logic that results in several participants rating Boromir and Gimli unfavorably. They either see Boromir as undermining the community of the Fellowship, or Gimli as not contributing much to that community. Jorge J.E. Garcia's chapter also depicts community as a pivotal idea in Tolkien's work. He contends that, quote, happiness is achievable only in a social context, and its key is love. For humans as well as for hobbits, happiness requires fellowship with others. Close quote. Garcia breaks down the concepts of community and fellowship into their components of loyalty and sharing. It is the transgression of this sense of sharing, the greed of Boromir, that makes him less likable for many participants. Interestingly, it is this same impulse that humanizes Boromir. As we will see in the next section, this makes him more relatable for participants. So perhaps the most concise summation of these various moral observations is presented by Douglas K. Blunt. He indicates that individuals need strength, which, quote, manifests itself most clearly not in the exercise of power, but rather in the willingness to give it up, close quote. And that, quote, the portrait that Tolkien presents to us then is one of community, humility, love, and sacrifice, close quote. These cumulative observations help to secure several key concepts of the moral values espoused throughout the text. This contention also resonates well with the interviews from participants. While it is Sam's selfless love of Frodo that makes participants love him, it is Boromir's pridefulness and selfish grab for the ring that makes participants dislike him. So finally, let's talk about the most relatable characters. The fact that a hobbit, Sam, is the most relatable character is probably not surprising. In fact, Likowski argues that, quote, most readers of The Lord of the Rings identify strongly with the hobbits for natural reasons, close quote. This is perhaps even less surprising because the sample is of young readers. At the same time, the fact that a human, Boromir, is one of the most relatable characters is also not surprising. although this is tricky when considering the movie adaptations, as I will mention below. So the fact that Sam's fidelity and his humble position are the main reasons why participants see him as their favorite character and as the most relatable agrees with most of Tolkien scholarship. For example, Marion Zimmer Bradley's chapter Men, Halflings, and Hero Worship discusses how Sam achieves heroism, quote, undesired and unrecognized, close quote, and how he is, quote, the only one of the characters who truly passes out of the heroic age and into the world of today, close quote. Perhaps it is also worth remembering that Tolkien's 1951 letter to Milton Waldman, in which he uses the phrase the chief hero to describe Sam. All of these observations would align Sam more with a reader who does not perceive themselves as a hero. Since younger readers are more likely in a position that has less authority and agency than adult readers, it is not surprising that they may not see themselves as heroes in the traditional sense. This perspective would naturally lead young readers to see Sam as a very relatable character. The seemingly contradictory position of Boromir as both the least favorite and second most relatable character is also in keeping with what's found in Tolkien scholarship. Many scholars have discussed how Boromir's flaws make him the most human or believable character. As Anne C. Petty notes in Tolkien and the Land of Heroes, quote, he may be arrogant, but his courage is genuine. True, he can't resist the temptation of the ring, but as a mortal man, Tolkien didn't expect him to. Boromir is allowed redemption through his brave defense of his hobbit companions, close quote. Boromir is not the most heroic or noble character from the Fellowship, but both scholars and participants are willing to give him the benefit of the doubt because of how they're able to understand his motivations. It seems that young readers are apt to read most of the characters in the Fellowship in a sympathetic light. That is, when considering the actions or thoughts of these characters, participants use their own life experience as a lens to try to understand the characters' motivations. This has implications on why many participants see Boromir as relatable, but also why they are willing to see hobbits, elves, dwarves, and other peoples as human-like. Most participants see shared experiences with many groups, regardless of the individual character's background. So to conclude, let's talk a little bit more about relatability and then draw some conclusions. So in several regards, young participants largely agree with the major patterns found in Tolkien scholarship. When it comes to discussion of characters within the story, while their readings may not go beyond the book in the way that scholarship tends to, with its reliance on secondary literature, their readings of specific instances and actions within the text are just as complex as those of many adult readers. Therefore, while this study largely indicates that in several aspects, the perception of young readers matches the consensus view of Tolkien scholarship, it also indicates that young readers bring more complexity and diversity to their understanding of the text than might be assumed by scholars. But this analysis pushes further in two areas. First, it provides commentary on the idea of the reluctant hero. While not a completely modern phenomenon, this trope has seen a marked resurgence in the past century with the elevation of pessimism, irony, and the anti-hero in the popular consciousness. So think Han Solo from Star Wars, Ender from Ender's Game, or Case from Neuromancer. As Deborah C. Rogers noted all the way in 1975, quote, one of the notable features of the 20th century literature is the anti-hero. Northrop Frye's iconic literary mode has taken over our everyday lives, close quote. This means that considering the hobbits as reluctant heroes helps to situate them, as scholars often desire, within the 20th century context in which Tolkien was writing. In a way, young readers invalidate this impulse. By interpreting the hobbits as characters like themselves, they indicate how readers often find such characters to be very personable, approachable, and significant in their reading of the story. This makes sense given the prior scholarship which addresses the ways in which the hobbits are childlike. See Tisa Ho, Derek S. Brewer, or Jonathan D. Langford, and others. This indicates how a reader, being situated in the modern period, can interact on a much more personal level with a character who reflects modern concerns than with a character who reflects a more medieval or pre-modern concerns. Such a case becomes increasingly evident when one considers the film adaptations of the text. Peter Jackson changes several characters in a way that makes them less self-assured and more approachable. What this does is make these characters more personable for a modern viewership. If we look at characters like Aragorn, Gandalf, and Legolas, and even Gimli, all of whom went through this kind of change during the adaptation process, this trend looks valid. On an anecdotal level, I've heard many fans of the movie say that they relate best to Aragorn, Gandalf, or Legolas out of all the members of the Fellowship. I've seldom heard a reader claim that they relate best to these characters. This interpretation of the interpretations of young readers cataloged in this study would appear to agree with this casual observation. While 13 participants claimed that one of these 4 characters was their favorite, only 7 found one of them to be the most relatable character, so almost half as many. Inversely, characters like Pippin, Merry, Sam, and Boromir came out looking very well when one compares the results of relatability and favorability, and that's what these 2 pie charts are demonstrating. While only one third of participants claimed that one of these characters was their favorite, more than half found one of them to be the most relatable. So the second place that this analysis pushes further is the response of young readers to characterization. Characterization can have meaningful implications for the study of fantasy literature as a whole. Speaking more generally, Tolkien's diversity in the depiction of heroism is not unusual in fantasy literature. Indeed, in their definition for heroes and heroines, Clute and Grant note that they note that, quote, heroes and heroines are fairly essential to high fantasy and heroic fantasy, close quote, and then proceed to give a list of 10 different hero types often found in this kind of literature, which they claim is not exhaustive. Therefore, an emphasis on and appreciation of the complexities in heroism aligns Tolkien with much of the fantasy genre. In fact, throughout the Encyclopedia of Fantasy, Clute and Grant note how several characters from The Lord of the Rings can function as exemplars for different hero types. Since Tolkien is often used as the model for fantasy, the considerations raised by these interviews have practical implications for the way that scholars discuss heroes and protagonists, not just in The Lord of the Rings, but in fantasy literature in general. So namely, Tolkien and fantasy scholars need to emphasize and recenter the voices of readers within their scholarship. We are trained to listen to other scholars and experts in an effort to drive our own research further and deeper. However, this has created an unbalanced approach. Tolkien scholarship is in a prime position to be a corrective on this tendency because it still exists in a liminal space. It is finding more academic approval, but still has a large number of independent scholars and non-traditional scholarship. We can find a way to create a more inclusive and diverse scholarship, and we can influence the larger field of fantasy scholarship if we commit to taking these voices into consideration as we write. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. Awesome. Very good. All right. So we have some questions here, and getting us started. Well, Eileen Moore had considered what, about female names and why there are no female names, but then, realized that you were limiting this to just the fellowship itself. Mm-hmm. Michael asks, what is the general view of heroism in the UK these days? I've lived in the US since the mid-'80s, but when I lived in the UK, the question, who is your hero, would have seemed odd. However, since the Iraq War, Americans seem to be completely and regularly comfortable with saying things like, my sister, high school principal, etc., is my hero. What is a hero in the question? What is a hero in the question you ask the students?
So the definition of a hero to popular culture at large is a bit beyond the scope of the project. In fact, as I mentioned in the presentation, I didn't actually ask these participants who their hero was. Instead, I asked them who their favorite and least favorite characters were. And through the discussions of their favorite characters, I came to find that the way that they talked about their favorite characters had a lot of similarities with the way that scholars talked about the idea of heroism in The Lord of the Rings. And so typically within Tolkien scholarship, there are some trends about the way that we talk about heroism, like sacrifice tends to be a very large trend, and we see that over and over again with Frodo's dedication to undertake the quest, Aragorn taking on the mantle of kingship, with Gandalf's sacrifice in Moria. So there are things like that that come up over and over again within scholarship. And for a lot more detail about that, let me know, and I can share, because there's a whole literature review that I have for that I can share.
Nice, thanks. Thanks, Luke. Nancy asks, any difference between English and American respondents?
So in this case, we had 30 participants that were spread all over the world from, I think we had some in Tasmania, we had some in Germany, we had some in the UK, we had several across the US in different places. There were no major trends identified in any national group whatsoever. Now, that's probably because it was limited to 30 participants in the study. So we didn't have a large enough sample size to develop trends within, the 3 or 4 participants that we had in different countries. But we didn't see anything like all of the participants from the UK thought this one thing and no one else did. So we didn't see any noticeable trends in that regard.
Thank you. Anna Small asks, what was the proportion of male and female young readers in your study? Was it possible for any of them to name Galadriel or Éowyn as their favorite characters, or could these characters be part of a future study that you might do?
So we did limit it to just the members of the fellowship, and actually a lot of that had to do with the function followed the form. Actually, that diamond ranking thing that I showed you had 9 spaces when I first came across it, and I was like, oh, there are 9 members of the fellowship. That fits perfectly. And so that's part of the reason why it was limited to just members of the fellowship. So they didn't have the potential to rate female characters. That is certainly something that I'd like to do more investigation into, because I have seen a lot of commentary about the ways that gender has to do with those reading norms, right? So for instance, if you follow on Twitter, Una McCormack, a New York Times bestselling author, she shared on Twitter how her daughter could not get into The Hobbit at all, just wasn't really relating to the story until they started reading it as the adventure of Belladonna Baggins instead of Bilbo Baggins. Then suddenly, oh, she started relating to this character and enjoying the book a lot more. So that certainly is an important consideration, and it is something I do want to look into in the future. In terms of our spread of male-female participants in the study, I can't remember offhand. I need to look back at my demographics, but it was weighted towards the male side. I think it was like 2/3 male, 1/3 female in the study, and one preferred not to say.
Thank you. Annie asks if you could remind us what the age group of the readers was.
So it was participants under the age of 18, and our youngest participant was age 7.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a question? Because apparently, since I'm a panelist, I couldn't type it in. So
yeah.
I just wanted to know if most of your respondents, if they had read the book, or if they were basing their responses on the movie.
Mm-hmm. So one of our requirements to participate was they had to have read at least The Fellowship of the Rings. And so I think every single participant had read, well, I think there was one participant who had not read past The Fellowship of the Rings. All the other participants had read all through The Lord of the Rings. More than half of them had read The Hobbit. And remember, this is under 18. More than half of them had read The Silmarillion. More than 1/3 of them had read some other book by Tolkien. And so this was a very highly motivated group, obviously, and that's probably a bit of what we call self-selection bias. It's who is the group that's going to volunteer to be a part of the study, and it's certainly going to be those most avid readers of Tolkien. So that's probably a little bit, that's probably not an accurate assessment of your average under 18 Tolkien fan. It's probably a very motivated group.
Yeah. Did you ask them if they had seen the movie as well?
We did. We did ask them if they had seen the movies. One thing we did not ask them was which came first, because we weren't necessarily interested in which framed their interpretation. We wanted to see what their interpretation was right now. It's a snapshot of their current interpretation.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thanks, Luke.
Mm-hmm.
I was surprised to see, I don't know, Legolas as the most heroic. In the movies, certainly they kind of, blow him up to something, ridiculously dexterous and heroic. But in the book, I just don't, I didn't see it. So I had the same question that I was thinking.
Well, I didn't have time to go into Legolas. He is the third most favorite character, and you'd be surprised because a lot of the people who rated him as their favorite had very personal reasons. So like one of our participants practiced archery, and so he liked that Legolas was an archer. Another one liked the specific kind of character in video games where they can stand back and cause damage. So he liked that Legolas was an archer. So a lot of personal things like that were the reason for Legolas being rated so highly.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. We have a little bit more time. Does anyone else want to throw a question in the Q&A?
I should mention that this is a very, very kind of top level overview of the project. If you want much more detailed look, is going to come in the world building panel that Chris Swank is hosting. That's really going to dig down into some very small minutia of the same study.
Good. I'd like to ask another one, if that's okay. And just I'm just curious, what inspired this project? Like, where did this interest in getting more information on how young readers are responding to Lord of the Rings, where did that come from for you?
So the inspiration was really partly my own process of interacting with Tolkien and then developing as a Tolkien fan and then a Tolkien researcher, because I realized as I grew up, there were certain impressions and thoughts that I had about the work that as I started interacting with other people, that's not how other people interpreted the work. And so this was as like a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, so naturally, what do? I change my interpretation to fit the consensus viewpoint. And so what I was curious about was, are those interpretations still out there for young readers? And can I get a snapshot of those before they try to change them? And I did find a few of those. For instance, we had one participant who thought Mary was a woman because in their experience, Mary was a girl's name. So in the interview, the participant said, I know he's a boy now, but I thought he was a girl the whole time. But then throughout the interview, the participant would mess up the pronouns still. So that was a lingering interpretation. And then, so just little things like that. I was trying to see if there were other people who had had a similar experience, other young readers like that. To give you an example, I was afraid of Tom Bombadil in my first reading because Gandalf said, don't trust anybody outside of the Shire. So how did I know that Tom Bombadil wasn't working with Old Man Willow to trap the hobbits? So I did not trust Tom Bombadil until he set the hobbits on the road and said bye. And I was like, oh, I guess he was an okay guy.
That's great. Hey, John Holmes has one more, just a point really. My wife showed the Lord of the Rings films for the Christian youth group she ran, and all the 8th grade girls were in love with Legolas because of Orlando Bloom. So as Luke says, personal reasons. Yep. Okay, good. Any last thoughts or questions? All right, well then that's thank you, Luke, very much for giving your paper and also for helping run this entire event today. So thank you. Thanks again.
Sure thing.